The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, the whole town of Harlan Creek knew what it said before Clara Whitmore had finished reading it herself. She was standing at the dry goods counter when Margaret Hollis leaned across the sugar bins and said, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear, "So it's true then. You've been sitting on Whitmore money this whole time, letting that poor man break his back thinking he was saving you." Clara set the letter down on the counter. Her hands were steady, her face gave nothing away. But inside something cracked, not from shame, not from guilt, from the sheer exhaustion of being misread by people who had already decided what kind of woman she was before she ever opened her mouth. If this were you, if everything you had quietly built, every sacrifice you had made without asking for credit, every choice you had made out of genuine conviction suddenly became evidence of your dishonesty, what would you do? Would you explain yourself to people who had already stopped listening? Or would you let the story they invented about you burn until only the truth was left standing? Don't go anywhere. Subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, because what happens next is the kind of thing people in Harlan Creek are still talking about 30 years later. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer Ethan Cole turned 36, he stopped counting what he had lost and started counting what he still had left to lose. It was a shorter list than it used to be. The north pasture was cracked through like old porcelain, the grass so dry it crunched under boot heels even before noon. The creek that had given the town its name still ran, but low, a thin, flat ribbon of brown water that did nothing useful for anything larger than a jackrabbit. 3 of his ranch hands had quit before July, not because they were lazy men, but because they were practical ones. A man with a family didn't stay on a sinking ship out of loyalty. He got off and found a ship that floated. Ethan didn't blame them. He stood at the fence line on a Thursday evening with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand and looked at what 17 years of work had produced, and he thought, "This is still mine." For now. He was a big man, rangy and deliberate the way men get when they've spent years doing physical labor without anyone around to watch or care whether they did it right. His face had weathered into something that read as older than his age, not from illness, but from the particular kind of tiredness that comes from grief that never fully announced itself and therefore never fully left. He had a way of going still when things got hard. Not the stillness of a man who had given up, but the stillness of a man who had learned that panic wasted energy, and energy was the one thing he couldn't afford to waste. His wife, Ruth, had been dead for 4 years. He did not speak of her, not to the hands, not to the neighbors, not to the one friend he still had left in town, a man named George Patton, who ran the feed store and occasionally showed up on Sunday evenings with a bottle of something decent and the good sense not to ask questions. What Ethan had never told anyone, not even George, was that it wasn't only grief that had hollowed him out. It was the specific shame of a man who had worked himself to near ruin trying to save a ranch that his wife had quietly asked him, in the last months of her life, whether they might consider selling. "We could go somewhere easier, Ethan. Somewhere the land doesn't fight you every season." He had said no. He had said the land was worth fighting for. He had said things would turn around, and then she was gone, and he was still fighting, and the land still didn't care. And now he was 36 years old, standing at a fence he'd repaired himself 4 times in 3 years, looking at a piece of earth that kept asking for more than he had to give. The letter from the land bank had arrived that morning. He hadn't opened it yet. He knew what it said. He'd been knowing what it was going to say for the better part of 6 months. He poured the cold coffee into the dirt and went inside. The house was quiet in a way that had a shape to it, quiet like a held breath. The kind of quiet that a man could lose himself in if he wasn't careful, because it required nothing of him and asked no questions and never looked at him like he was failing. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the letter. The bank was not unsympathetic. That was how the man had written it. "We are not unsympathetic to your situation, Mr. Cole, but the outstanding balance on the property loan, combined with the second lien filed last spring, places the ranch in a position that requires resolution by the end of the calendar year." Resolution. As if 17 years of his life were a math problem with a clean answer at the bottom. He set the letter down and sat with it for a long time. He was not a man who prayed. He was not a man who asked for things he couldn't see a clear path to receiving, but he sat there in that quiet kitchen and let himself feel, for just a few minutes, the full weight of what he was looking at and what it would mean if it all came apart. Then he got up, made a fresh cup of coffee, and started thinking practically. He had 3 options. He could sell the east quarter of the land, the only piece worth anything to the neighbors, and use the money to service the debt and buy himself another 18 months. He could go to his brother Dale in Billings and ask for money, which was something he would genuinely rather lose the ranch than do. Or he could do the thing that George Patton had been gently suggesting for the better part of a year, in the careful way George suggested everything. There's women out west who need a good situation, Ethan, a practical arrangement, nothing shameful about it. He had dismissed it every time. He thought about it now. It wasn't the idea of another person in the house that bothered him. It was the idea of what that person would see when they got here. The debt. The failing land. The particular way the silence in this house had weight and texture by now had become its own kind of presence, almost companionable, in the way that things you've lived with long enough start to feel like they belong. But a woman who came into a hard situation with open eyes, who understood what it was and didn't expect it to be something else. That was a different proposition than romance. That was a partnership. He could do a partnership. He wrote the letter in one sitting without drafting it first, which was unlike him. He was, in most things, a man who thought before he acted. But with this, he found that thinking too long would talk him out of it, and he was not in a position to be talked out of practical solutions. I'm a rancher in Harlan Creek, Montana, 36 years old. The ranch is struggling, but it is mine, and I intend to keep it. I am looking for a woman who understands that this is a practical arrangement. I can offer a home, food, security, and honest dealing. I cannot offer romance or promises I don't know how to keep. If you're a woman who has been disappointed before and would rather have honesty than pretty words, write back. He sent it through the placement service in Billings, which George had recommended. And then he did not think about it for 2 weeks. The reply came from a woman named Clara Whitmore in Missouri. She was 34. She had been a school teacher. She was a widow. Her letter was 3 paragraphs long, and every sentence in it said exactly what it meant and no more, which struck him as so unusual that he read it twice. I am not looking for a man to rescue me. I am looking for a situation that is honest and requires something of me. I have been a school teacher for 11 years, and I am better at managing chaos than most people suspect. I have no illusions about what a struggling ranch in Montana looks like. My late husband was a farmer. I understand debt. I understand seasons that go wrong. I understand working beside someone without needing them to say anything other than what is true. I accept your terms. I will arrive on the 14th, if that is acceptable to you. He wrote back, "That is acceptable." And then he cleaned the house for the first time in 4 months, which was not something he would have admitted to anyone. Clara Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday, which was already not how he'd planned it. He'd planned to meet her at the station in his better shirt, the one without the fraying collar, but a fence line had gone down in the east pasture at 6 that morning, and he'd spent 4 hours fixing it and arrived at the station 20 minutes late, still dirty, with the wrong shirt on and a cut on the back of his left hand from the wire. She was standing beside a single suitcase when he got there, not looking anxious or annoyed, just looking around at the town with the particular attention of someone filing things away for later use. She was medium height, dark-haired, dressed practically in a brown traveling dress that had been mended at the left sleeve in a way that was visible if you looked but didn't look careless. It looked like the work of someone who knew how to make things last. She looked at him the way people look at something they've been given a description of and are now comparing against the original. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He looked at the suitcase. "Is that all?" "That's all." He picked up the suitcase, and she fell in beside him without being asked, and they walked to the wagon without saying anything else, which he found either remarkably comfortable or remarkably strange and couldn't quite tell which. On the road back to the ranch, she asked him 3 questions. How many working hands he had left, what the state of the kitchen garden was, and whether the house had a second bedroom or whether they would need to discuss arrangements. He answered all 3 honestly, including the part about the kitchen garden being a dead patch of ground with ambitions. She nodded at each answer like she was making calculations. He didn't ask her anything. He didn't know what to ask. He was a man who had been alone in his house for 4 years and had forgotten, if he ever knew, how to talk to another person about ordinary things. Ruth had done most of the talking. He had done most of the working. It had been a reasonable division. When they pulled up in front of the ranch house, she got out of the wagon before he could come around to help her, which was either rude or efficient, and he again couldn't tell which. She stood and looked at the house for a moment. He stood beside her and looked too, trying to see it the way she was seeing it. The sagging porch railing, the window that had been boarded over on the south side since last winter when a branch came through it. The general air of a place that had been maintained enough to keep standing, but not enough to look like anyone took pride in it. He waited for her to say something polite and untrue. She said, "That railing needs to come down and be rebuilt. Patching it won't hold." She turned and looked at him directly. "Do you have a full set of carpentry tools or just basic ones?" "Full set," he said. "Why?" "Because I know how to use them," she said. "My father was a carpenter before he was a farmer. I grew up learning both." He looked at her. She looked back, steady and patient, like she'd already decided she wasn't going to apologize for being useful. He picked up her suitcase and carried it inside. The first week was an education in ways he hadn't expected. He had assumed, without examining the assumption, that a woman coming into a struggling ranch as a practical partner would need time to settle in before she was useful, that there would be a period of adjustment, of learning the rhythms of the place, of figuring out where things were kept and how things were done. Clara Whitmore did not appear to have read that script. By the end of the second day, she had reorganized the kitchen in a way that initially irritated him. Things were not where he expected them to be, and twice he reached for something that wasn't there anymore. But by the end of the week, he had to admit, privately and with some reluctance, that the new arrangement made more sense than the old one. Pots near the stove, dry goods close to the counter where you worked with them, coffee supplies in a place where you could find them without standing there with your eyes half open at 5 in the morning, wondering if you'd lost your mind. She found the small room off the back of the kitchen, a room he'd been using to store broken equipment and old newspapers, and cleaned it out in a single afternoon. He watched her carry out the fourth load of accumulated junk and said, "What are you doing with that?" "Making a classroom," she said, without slowing down. "There's no school out here." "There are 6 children within a mile of this property who aren't attending school because there's no school close enough," she said. "I spoke to 2 of their mothers yesterday." He stood in the doorway of what was going to become, apparently, a classroom. "You spoke to the neighbors." "I introduced myself," she said, in a tone that suggested this was not a complicated action. He had not introduced himself to the neighbors in approximately 2 years, possibly longer. He went back to work. The ranch hands, what was left of them, 2 men named Hector and Bobby, who had stayed out of stubbornness and a particular attachment to the place that neither of them would have admitted to out loud, watched Clara with the careful attention of men who have seen their share of women try to impose order on hard places and fail, and who were waiting to see if this one would be different. She was different, not in any dramatic way, not in a way that announced itself. She didn't try to manage them or organize them or explain to them how things should be done. She asked questions, practical, specific questions about what was working and what wasn't, about which parts of the operation had been let go and which parts were worth saving. She listened to the answers. She remembered what she'd been told and referred back to it later. Hector, who had been on the coal ranch for 11 years and was not a man given to changing his opinions quickly, told Bobby at the end of the first week, "She's not what I expected." Bobby said, "What did you expect?" Hector thought about it. "I don't know. Something softer. Or something harder. She's neither." She started the informal school the following Monday. 3 children the first day, then 5, then 7. She taught them in the back room with whatever materials she'd brought with her, and supplemented with whatever she could get from town, and she was serious about it in the way that people are serious about the things they actually believe in, rather than the things they're performing belief in for the sake of appearances. Ethan watched this from a distance. That was how he processed most things, from a distance, with time, without saying anything before he'd thought it through. What he was thinking through, without quite admitting it, was that he had made a calculation when he wrote that letter. He had calculated for a partnership, someone to help stabilize what was destabilizing, to provide a second income of labor and management, to make the house function the way a house was supposed to function. He had not calculated for someone who made the house feel like it was inhabited by people who intended to be there. He had not calculated for the sound of children's voices coming from the back room on a Monday morning. He had not calculated for the fact that she was quietly, methodically, without any fuss, making things better. Not just managing things, actually improving them. He ate dinner at the kitchen table for the first time in what he figured was at least a year and a half. He had gotten into the habit of eating standing at the counter or taking a plate to the porch, not because he'd made a decision to do it that way, but because there hadn't been a reason to sit at the table when there was no one to sit at it with, and at some point standing had become the default, and then the habit, and then the thing he didn't think about anymore. Clara set the table. She cooked something that used the beans and the smoked pork, and a handful of dried herbs he hadn't known were in the back of the pantry, and she set 2 plates and 2 cups and sat down. He stood at the counter for a moment, holding his plate. She looked at him across the table without saying anything, without making it an issue, without explaining why she had set the table for 2. He sat down. They ate. They talked a little about the east pasture, about the condition of the equipment, about the fact that one of the irrigation channels needed to be cleared before the next watering cycle, or they were going to lose water pressure to the south side. It was not a warm conversation. It was not unfriendly. It was 2 people dealing with the business of a hard situation and doing it respectfully. But he noticed, after she'd gone to bed, and he was sitting alone with the last of his coffee, that the kitchen felt different than it had an hour ago. Not better, exactly. Just inhabited, like a place where something was happening. He sat with that feeling for a while, turning it over, not quite sure what to do with it. Outside, the land was dark and dry and indifferent, the way it always was. Inside, for the first time in 4 years, something had shifted. He told himself it was just the table, the habit of sitting at the table. He told himself it would wear off. He was wrong about both things. By the end of the 3rd week, 2 things had happened that he had not expected. The first was that a family named Gunderson, whose farm was 2 miles to the east and who had been quietly drowning under a bad harvest, and a series of small disasters that had compounded into a large one, had started sending their daughter Marta to Clara's informal school. Marta was 11 and sharp as a tack, and had not been in a classroom in 18 months because the nearest school was too far and the family couldn't spare her most days anyway. Clara was teaching her reading and arithmetic and apparently basic accounting. She had decided that Marta was old enough to learn how to keep books, and Marta had decided that this was the most interesting thing she'd ever been asked to do. Hector mentioned this to Ethan one morning at the barn, in the offhand way that Hector mentioned things he thought were significant but didn't want to seem too interested in. "The Gunderson girl has started staying for lunch," he said. Ethan said, "Is that right?" Mrs. Cole asked her mother, said it wasn't a burden. Ethan turned this over. He thought about the fact that Hector had called her Mrs. Cole. He had not given the hands any guidance about what to call her. Apparently they had decided on their own. The second thing that happened was that Ethan began to notice, in the way that a man notices something he's been deliberately not noticing, that he looked forward to dinner. Not to dinner in the abstract, not to the food, though the food was better than what he'd been making for himself for 4 years. To dinner in the specific way that meant sitting across the table from Clara Whitmore, from Clara Cole, he supposed, because she'd taken the name for the purposes of the arrangement, and talking about the day's work and the next day's needs, and occasionally something that had nothing to do with either. She had opinions. This did not surprise him. What surprised him was that her opinions were things he hadn't thought of, and that when she said them, they didn't feel like arguments but like offers. Here's a way of looking at this that you might not have considered. She had told him 3 nights ago that she thought the problem with the north pasture wasn't the soil, it was the rotation. That they'd been running the same animals over the same ground in the same pattern for so long that the land was exhausted in specific ways that could be addressed if they thought about the rotation differently. He had started to say that they'd always done it that way, and then stopped, because that was not a real argument. He had thought about what she said for 2 days. Then he'd started making adjustments. He didn't tell her he was doing it. She didn't ask. But one morning she looked at what he was doing with the north pasture and nodded slightly and went on with her own work. And he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. The particular small satisfaction of being understood without needing to explain yourself. It was a dangerous feeling. He knew it was dangerous the moment he identified it, because he was not a man who could afford to attach himself to things that might leave. The ranch had taught him that, if nothing else. You didn't count on the rain, you didn't count on the market price. You didn't count on anything you couldn't build with your own hands and maintain with your own work. He told himself to be careful. He told himself this was a partnership, and partnerships were functional things, not emotional ones. He went to bed that night and lay in the dark and listened to the quiet of the house. A different quiet than it used to be. A quiet that had a person in it now. A presence in the next room. The occasional sound of her moving around before she settled, and told himself, again, that he was being careful. He was not being careful. The first fight happened on a Saturday, which somehow felt appropriate, because Saturdays were when everything that had been held together during the week started showing its seams. He had ridden into town that morning for feed, and come back to find that Clara had made a decision about the old equipment shed, had, with Bobby's help, moved 3 pieces of unusable equipment out of it and into the yard, and had apparently already spoken to someone in town about having it hauled away. It was not a large thing. He knew it was not a large thing, but it was his land and his equipment and his shed, and she had made a decision about it without asking him, and he had walked into the yard to find it done, and something in him had reacted in a way that was about more than the shed. He set down the feed sacks with more force than necessary. "I would have preferred to be asked," he said. Clara looked at him. She had dirt on her hands and a work apron on, and she looked like exactly what she was, a woman who had been working hard all morning, and her expression was not defensive. "The shed is in the way of extending the kitchen garden," she said. "I thought we'd agreed the kitchen garden was a priority." "We agreed the garden was a priority. We didn't agree to move equipment without asking me first." "You weren't here." "Then you could have waited until I was." A pause. A very specific kind of pause. "Ethan," she said, "Bobby and I were here, the timing was right, and the shed has been sitting full of things that don't work and can't be fixed for at least 3 years from what Bobby tells me. I made a call. If it was the wrong call, I'll hear that from you, but I'd like to understand the actual objection." He stood there with the unreasonable anger still in him, and he knew that the actual objection was not about the shed. The actual objection was that she had made a decision about something he had believed was his alone to make, and in doing so had reminded him that the ranch was no longer his alone, and that this was something he had agreed to and was still, apparently, struggling to adjust to. He didn't say any of that. He picked up the feed sacks and carried them to the barn. That night at dinner, the silence was different. Not the comfortable working silence of recent weeks, but something with edges in it. Clara said, partway through the meal, "I should have left a note." He looked up. "I didn't think to leave a note saying what I was doing and why. I should have." She said it simply, without performing contrition. "I'll do that going forward." He looked at her across the table. He thought about what it must have taken her, a woman who clearly had no shortage of confidence in her own judgment, to say that. "I overreacted," he said. "The shed. You were right about the shed." She nodded. Went back to eating. "I'm not very good at sharing decisions," he said. "I should tell you that." "I know," she said. He frowned slightly. "How do you know?" "Because you've been running this place alone for years, and men who've been running things alone for years don't suddenly become good at it just because someone shows up." She said it without judgment, like she was stating a fact about weather patterns. "You'll get better at it. I'm patient." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back, and he saw something in her face that he hadn't seen before. Not in the weeks since she'd arrived, not in the letter she'd written, not in any interaction since. Something that was not patience or efficiency or practicality, something that looked quietly and without making any claims, like understanding. He dropped his eyes back to his plate. "I'll try to be less of a problem," he said. "You're not a problem," she said. "You're a person." She paused. "There's a difference." He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. But he sat at the table until dinner was finished, and he did not take his plate to the counter. And when she got up to clear the dishes, he stood up and helped her, which was not something he had done before. She didn't comment on it. That was he was beginning to understand. One of the things about her. She didn't make a thing out of the things that didn't need to be made into things. Outside, the land was still dry. The debt was still real. The bank's letter was still sitting in the drawer where he'd put it. But the table was cleared and the kitchen was quiet in a good way, and somewhere in the back of the house he could hear the children's reading primers she'd left out, their neat stacked pages waiting for Monday. He thought about what she'd said. "You're not a problem. You're a person." He couldn't remember the last time someone had said something that simple to him that had landed as hard as that did. He went to bed that night thinking he should be more careful. He went to bed knowing he wasn't going to be. The Monday after the shed argument, Clara's informal school had 8 children in it. Ethan found this out not because she told him, but because he walked past the back room on his way through the house at 9:30 and heard a voice reciting multiplication tables. Not Clara's voice, a child's voice, flat and determined. 6 times 7 is 42, 6 times 8 is 48, and stopped in the hallway for a moment longer than he'd intended. There were 8 of them in there. He could tell by the sound the particular layered shuffle of children sitting on benches and trying to hold still, which children were not naturally good at. Clara was moving around the room. He could tell that too, her footsteps purposeful, pausing near one student and then another. He went on to the barn. But he thought about it for most of the morning in the background way that things settle into when you don't want to give them too much direct attention. 8 children meant 8 families who had decided, in the pragmatic and unsentimental way of frontier families, that what Clara was doing was worth trusting. That was not a small thing. People out here did not give their trust to strangers quickly, and they did not send their children to someone they hadn't made a judgment about. The fact that 8 of them had done it in 3 weeks said something. He wasn't entirely sure yet what it said. He let it sit. The first letter from the bank that actually required a response arrived on a Wednesday. Not the notification letter from 2 weeks ago. This was a follow-up, shorter and less politely worded, with a specific figure and a specific deadline. He read it at the kitchen table before breakfast, while the coffee was still brewing, and then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket because he did not want to leave it on the table. Clara came in from the back room where she'd been setting up for the morning's lessons. She looked at him and then looked at the shirt pocket where the letter was sitting. She didn't say anything. She poured herself coffee and sat down. He waited for her to ask. She didn't ask. He pulled the letter out and put it on the table between them. She read it without picking it up, leaning slightly forward, then sat back. "How much time do we have?" she said. "Not how bad is it? Not I thought you said the finances were manageable? Just how much time?" "Till the end of October," he said. 11 weeks. She turned her coffee cup in her hands, thinking. He waited. This was something he had learned about her in 3 weeks. That when she went quiet, it was not the quiet of someone at a loss. It was the quiet of someone working through something, and interrupting it was counterproductive. "The East Quarter," she said finally. "You've been thinking about selling it. It's the only piece worth selling. What does it get you?" "Enough to service the debt and buy another year. Maybe 18 months if the prices hold." She was quiet again. Then, "And after 18 months?" He looked at her. "After 18 months, either the ranch is turned around or I sell it outright." "Then we need it to turn around," she said, as if this were a conclusion they had reached together, which, in a way, he supposed they had. He said, "You make it sound straightforward." "It's not straightforward," she said, but it's clear. And clear is the part you can work with." She stood and picked up her coffee. "I'll look at the supply ledger this afternoon. There's money being spent on things that aren't paying back at the right ratio. I've been noticing it, but I didn't want to raise it before you were ready to have the conversation." He stared at her. "Before I was ready," he repeated. "You needed to settle," she said. Not unkindly. "New arrangement, new person in the house. You needed to settle before any of the harder conversations were useful." She paused. "Are you settled now?" He didn't know whether to be irritated or impressed by the precision of that. He chose neither, because neither felt like the right use of energy. "Look at the ledger," he said. She nodded and went to set up the classroom. He sat at the table for another minute, in the particular stillness of a man who has just been handled thoughtfully and is still deciding how he feels about it. The ledger conversation happened that evening and lasted nearly 2 hours, which was the longest conversation he could remember having with another person in years. Not an argument, an examination. She had gone through the supply records with the focused attention of someone who had been taught that numbers told stories if you read them right, and she had found several places where the story they told was not a good one. Feed costs were the worst of it. He had been buying from the same supplier for 8 years, on the strength of a handshake agreement that had felt like loyalty, but had, over time, calcified into a habit that the supplier had quietly taken advantage of. The prices had crept up over 4 years in small increments, small enough that no single increase had felt worth pushing back on, but accumulated into something that was now running 12% above the next closest option. 12%, he said when she showed him the comparison. 12.5, she said. I was being generous. He looked at the numbers. He felt, sitting there, the specific foolishness of a man who has been paying 12% extra for 8 years out of habit, dressed up as loyalty. It was not a comfortable feeling. He was not a stupid man. The fact that he had not seen this was not about intelligence. It was about the particular blindness that comes from running too hard for too long with too much on your shoulders. You stop being able to see sideways because all you can do is look at the ground in front of your feet. I'll talk to Harmon's next week, he said. I already got their prices, she said, and slid a piece of paper across the table. I spoke to their man in town on Tuesday. He looked at the paper. Then he looked at her. She looked back with an expression that was not quite apologetic and not quite satisfied. It was the expression of a woman who knew she had done something useful and slightly presumptuous and was waiting to see which one he was going to respond to. You spoke to their man in town, he said. I said I was making inquiries on behalf of the Cole Ranch, she said. I didn't commit to anything. You can walk away from it entirely, and I'll have wasted a conversation. You said Cole Ranch. That's what it is. A pause. He looked at the numbers again. Good numbers. Better than he'd hoped. I'll go see Harmon's myself tomorrow, he said. That's better, she said. Gives it more weight. He made the switch to Harmon's that week. The savings weren't dramatic month to month, but they compounded, and over the length of a season, they would matter. More than the numbers, what mattered was that he had spent an afternoon looking at the books with someone who understood what they meant and who didn't treat the information as an indictment of his management, who treated it as material, as something to work with. He had not had that before. Not since Ruth, and Ruth had trusted him to handle the books because he had insisted he had it managed, which had been, in retrospect, a pride-driven position that had cost them both. He thought about that more than he should have, probably. The first time one of the neighbors came to the ranch specifically to see Clara, not to see Ethan, not to ask about the land or the cattle or any of the ranch business, but to see Clara, was a woman named Agnes Renner, who arrived on a Thursday morning with a jar of preserved peaches and a look on her face that said she wasn't sure of her welcome. Ethan was at the fence line when she came in, and he watched from a distance as Clara came out onto the porch and spoke to her. He couldn't hear what was said, but the conversation went on for nearly 20 minutes, and at the end of it, Agnes Renner was standing differently than she'd been standing when she arrived. At dinner, he said, Agnes Renner came by. She did, Clara said. What did she want? A brief pause. Her youngest is having trouble with reading. She heard about the school, and she wanted to ask whether there was room. He thought about that. Agnes Renner's husband, Frank, was not an easy man. Not cruel exactly, but rigid. The kind of man who had decided the world worked a certain way and resisted evidence to the contrary. The fact that Agnes had come here on her own, with preserved peaches and a question, was not nothing. Did you say yes? He said. I said yes, Clara said. How many does that make? She thought about it. 10 now. I may need to split them into 2 groups by age if we get any more. He looked at her across the table. You've been here a month. 26 days, she said, and you've built a school. She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, more like the involuntary exhale of someone who finds a thing slightly absurd and slightly true at the same time. It's 1 room and a stack of borrowed books, she said. I wouldn't call it a school. Agnes Renner would, he said. Frank Renner's wife doesn't leave that farm for nothing. Clara looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. Not sentimentality, not pride. Something quieter. The look of a person who has been waiting to find out whether what they were building was real and has just received one piece of evidence that it might be. "I just teach the children what I know how to teach," she said. "The rest of it is them." He nodded, went back to eating, but he thought about what she'd said later, in the way that plain things said plainly sometimes demand more thought than complex things said elaborately. "I just teach the children what I know how to teach." He thought about the 12 years she'd been doing that before she came here. The life she'd had in Missouri, the schools she'd taught in, the husband she'd buried, the particular sequence of events that had led her to answer a stranger's practical letter and pack one suitcase and board a train to a place she'd never been. He realized he didn't know much about any of it. He hadn't asked. He had been, in the way of men who have spent years inside their own heads, so focused on managing his own situation that he had never asked much about hers. This felt, sitting with it in the quiet of the evening, like an oversight worth correcting. The opportunity came 2 nights later, naturally, the way things did when you stopped engineering them. They had finished dinner, and the evening was still light enough to sit on the porch, and she had brought her mending and he had brought his coffee, and they sat without talking for a while in the way that had become, without either of them deciding it, a habit. He said, "What was it like? Missouri?" She looked at him sideways. The mending needle paused. "Which part?" she said. "Any of it. Teaching. Before you came here." She considered this in the way she considered most things, taking it seriously without making a performance of doing so. "It was good work," she said. "I was good at it. Better than I was at other things." She paused. "My husband, Thomas, was a farmer. Grain, mostly. He wasn't a hard man to live with, but he was sick for the last 2 years, and the farm went to his family when he died because his brother contested the will, and I didn't have the money to fight it." She said this without bitterness, or rather, with a bitterness that had been lived with long enough that it had become something more durable and less sharp. "I had my teaching position, but the school board decided they preferred a younger teacher. So," he sat with this. He looked out at the dry land. "So you answered my letter," he said. "I answered your letter," she said, "because it was honest. I get tired of things that aren't honest." "It wasn't a very warm letter." "No," she said. "That's why I answered it." He turned this over. He understood, more than he would have expected to, the particular relief of something that did not promise more than it could deliver. He understood it from the inside. From the years of watching weather promises and market promises, and his own promises to Ruth about how things would turn around. "The brother," he said. "Thomas's brother. Did he—" "He got the farm," she said. "That's all." Something in her tone closed the subject gently but firmly, the way a door closes that isn't locked, but isn't inviting further entry either. He respected it. He dropped it. After a while she said, "What was Ruth like?" The question was quiet and direct, and it landed without warning, the way quiet, direct questions do. He was silent for a moment. "She was warm," he said, "warmer than this place deserved." He paused. "She wanted to leave in the end. I should have listened to that." Clara said nothing. "I kept thinking it would get better," he said. "The land, the money. I kept thinking one more season, one more year, and she trusted me on that for a long time." He stopped. He was not sure why he was saying this. He hadn't said it to George or to Hector or to anyone. "She died thinking I was going to make it better." A long silence. "Did she know you loved her?" Clara said. The question startled him. Not its inappropriateness. It wasn't inappropriate. Its directness. "Yes," he said. She knew that. "Then she didn't die without the thing that mattered," Clara said. Not comforting, exactly, just precise. Cutting through to the part of it that was true. He sat with that. The evening darkened around them. Somewhere out past the north pasture, a night bird called once and went quiet. He drank the last of his coffee, gone cold again. He seemed constitutionally unable to drink coffee while it was hot, some habit of delay that had calcified over years. "You don't talk much about yourself," she said. "Not really." "I know," he said. "Is that by preference, or by practice? He thought about it honestly. Both, probably. She nodded as if that were a sufficient answer. Maybe it was. He was aware, sitting there in the last of the evening light, of a feeling he could not quite name. Not comfort. He was not a comfortable man, and this was not a comfortable situation. Not happiness, because happiness was too large and too simple a word for what it was. It was something more like the sensation of a tight thing releasing. Slowly, by degrees, without drama. Just less constriction than there used to be. He was not sure what to do with that. The second argument happened 3 weeks later, and it was worse than the first. It started over something small. It always did, the way the real arguments always start over the thing that isn't the thing. Ethan had made a decision about the planning arrangement for the South Field without discussing it with her, and she found out from Bobby when she was doing the morning supply check, and she came to find him at the barn. He heard her footsteps and knew from the pace of them that something was wrong. "You changed the South Field planning without telling me," she said. He had his back to her, working on a harness that needed replacing on the second buckle. "I did," he said. "We talked about the South Field last week. We agreed to wait until we could discuss the rotation further. I looked at the soil and made a call," he said. "I've been farming this land for 17 years. Sometimes a call needs to get made in the morning before you can have a committee meeting." Silence. "I'm not a committee," she said. Something in her voice made him stop working. He turned around. She was standing in the barn doorway with the morning light behind her, and her face had an expression on it he hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, though there was something of that. Something that looked more like a wound. "You did exactly what you were angry at me for doing," she said. "With the shed, 6 weeks ago. You told me you'd prefer to be asked." He opened his mouth, closed it. She was right. He knew she was right in the same moment she said it, and there was no architecture of justification he could build around it quickly enough to change that fact. "Clara, I am trying," she said, and her voice was controlled but only just, "to be a real partner in this. Not a decoration, not someone to run the kitchen while you run everything else. You said you couldn't do this alone. That was the arrangement. That's why I'm here." She paused. "If that's not what you actually want, tell me now. While it's still an early enough mistake for both of us to walk back from it." The barn was very quiet. He set the harness down. "I reverted," he said. "When things got hard this week, I reverted to doing it the way I always do it. Alone." He looked at her directly. "That's not what I want. It's just what I know how to do without thinking." She held his gaze. Her jaw was set. "I need you to do the thinking," she said. "I need you to do the thinking even when it's harder than just deciding by yourself. Because that's what a partnership actually is. It's not efficient, and it's not always fast, and sometimes you're going to have to wait for me, and sometimes I'm going to be wrong, and either way, we decide together." He nodded. "Once. Like it was an oath." "I'll redo the South Field discussion tonight," he said. "You don't have to redo it. What you planted is probably fine." She exhaled. "Just next time. Before." "Next time before," he said. She turned and walked back toward the house. He watched her go. He stood in the barn for a few minutes, not moving, and looked at the place where she'd been standing. He thought about what she had said. "I'm trying to be a real partner in this." He had heard that, and he had thought for just a moment that she was talking about the ranch, the practical arrangement they'd agreed to, the work and the land and the debt. But she wasn't only talking about the ranch. He was starting to understand that. The harvest, when it came, was not good. But it was better than the year before. And that was a different kind of news than it might have seemed. Not triumph, but traction. Evidence that the adjustments were doing what they were supposed to do. The pasture rotation. The new feed supplier. The 3 repairs to the irrigation channels that Clara had quietly identified as pressure problems in the first 6 weeks. Hector told Ethan at the end of the first harvest day that he thought they'd make it through to spring. This was from Hector, who had not expressed optimism about anything since Ethan could remember. "That's something," Ethan said. "It's her," Hector said. Ethan looked at him. Hector shrugged, the casual shrug of a man who states facts without wanting to be thanked for them. "She got Bobby to fix the east irrigation 2 weeks before you asked him to. She noticed the pressure problem before either of us did. She figured out the rotation." "I decided on the rotation," Ethan said. "You decided," Hector said. She thought of it. Ethan had no response to that. Hector went back to work. The harvest went on for 10 days, and they were hard days, the kind that stripped the difference between people down to what was actually there, because exhaustion did not leave room for performance. Ethan worked from before dawn to past dark. Clara worked alongside, not the field work, which was beyond the arrangement anyone had intended, but the logistics of it, the feeding of the crew, the tracking of what had come in and what was left, the calculating of what they'd need to keep versus what could be sold and at what price. She did it with the same focused quiet she brought to everything, but there were cracks in it by the fourth day. He could see them, small signs of fatigue that she didn't acknowledge out loud, a slowing in her movements, a moment in the late evening where she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of her and didn't move for long enough that he looked up from his own chair. "Leave the rest till morning," he said. "I need to finish the count for Clara." He said it more quietly than he'd intended. "The count will be there in the morning. You need to sleep." She looked at him. She had dirt on her face and shadows under her eyes, and she looked, for the first time since she'd arrived, like a person instead of a force. "The numbers are bothering me," she said. "The south end came in lower than I expected." "I know. We'll look at it tomorrow." "What if it means we'll look at it tomorrow?" he said again. Something in her posture changed. Not defeat, something more like allowance. Like she was giving herself permission to be tired. She closed the ledger. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." She went to bed. He sat alone for another hour with the ledger she'd left on the table and looked at the South End numbers and tried not to feel the particular dread of a man who has gotten close enough to surviving that the prospect of not surviving has become newly terrible, because that was the part of it he hadn't expected. 3 months ago, if the South End had come in low, he would have absorbed it with a kind of grim acceptance, added it to the long list of things that weren't going the way they were supposed to, and kept moving. It would not have had a face. It would not have meant something beyond the numbers. Now it meant something. He sat there and admitted to himself in the privacy of the quiet kitchen that he was afraid. Not of the debt, not of the bank, not of the land. He was afraid of what it would mean if this didn't work. Not for the ranch. For the thing that had been quietly growing in the space between them, in the dinner conversations, and the porch evenings, and the arguments that ended in honesty, in the way she handed him information without condescension and accepted his silences without taking them personally, and said, once, in a voice that was not performing anything, "You're not a problem, you're a person." He was afraid of losing that. He closed the ledger and went to bed, and lay in the dark for a long time, and thought about how quickly a thing you hadn't counted on could become the thing you couldn't imagine being without. Outside, the last of the harvest moon hung over the dry land like a question without an answer. Inside the house, 2 people slept in separate rooms and pretended, in the way that people do when they are not yet ready for the truth, that what they were building together was only a practical arrangement. Neither of them quite believed it anymore. The South End numbers turned out to be less catastrophic than they'd feared. Not good. The yield was down 11% from the projection Clara had built in September, and 11% was real money in a situation where there wasn't much margin. But not the disaster that had kept Ethan awake at the kitchen table. When they sat down with the full harvest count the morning after the last field came in, Clara went through the ledger column by column with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and by the time she reached the bottom of the page, she had found enough adjustments in the operating costs to partially offset the shortfall. "We're still short for the October payment," she said. "I know," he said, "but not by much." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to the number at the bottom. "If we sell the 3 older steers now instead of waiting for spring prices, we close the gap." He looked at the number. It was tight. It was the kind of tight that required everything to go right for the next 2 months and left no room for anything that wasn't right. "Spring prices would be better," he said. "Spring prices would be better if we have the October payment," she said. "We don't." He sold the steers that week. The morning he came back from town with the bank receipt in his pocket, he found Clara at the kitchen table with Marta Gunderson, the 11-year-old who had been coming to the school since September. They were bent over a ledger, not the ranch ledger, a smaller one Clara had apparently made for Marta, and they were talking about ratios, not school ratios, Actual farming ratios, the kind that mattered to a family trying to figure out whether their season had left them ahead or behind. He stood in the doorway. Marta looked up. "Mr. Cole?" "Marta." He looked at the ledger. "What are you working on?" "Mrs. Cole is showing me how her father does the accounts," Marta said, with the particular certainty of a child who has found something that makes sense to her and has claimed it. Except she says her father's way is old-fashioned in one part. "One part," Clara said, without looking up. "The rest of it holds." He poured himself coffee and left them to it. Later, in the evening, after Marta had gone home and the dinner things were cleared, he put the bank receipt on the table in front of Clara without saying anything. She picked it up, read it, set it down. "October's clear," she said. "October's clear," he confirmed. She nodded. There was a moment of something, not celebration. They were not people who celebrated the absence of disaster, but something. A brief shared breath that acknowledged the territory they'd just crossed together. Then she said, "I need to tell you something." And the quality of those words made him set his coffee down. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the table, at the bank receipt, at the particular grain of the wood underneath it, and her expression had the careful stillness of someone who has been deciding whether to say a thing for long enough that the deciding had become its own kind of weight. "All right," he said. She reached into the pocket of her apron and put a letter on the table. It was already opened. The envelope had been handled, the edges soft with wear, in the way that suggested it had been taken out and put back more than once. He looked at it. The postmark was from Kansas City, 3 weeks ago. He did not reach for it. He waited. "It's from the Whitmore family attorney," she said. "Thomas's family. His father died in August." She paused. "The old man changed his will before he went. He left me a portion of the estate. His brother Gerald's contestation of Thomas's will, the one that took the farm. The old man apparently felt, at the end of his life, that it had been wrong." Ethan was very still. "How large a portion?" he said. She told him the number. He sat with it. It was not a small number. It was the kind of number that changed the shape of a situation entirely, that turned a conversation about whether to sell 3 steers in October into a conversation about something else altogether. 3 weeks, he said. She looked at him now. "The letter is 3 weeks old," he said. "Yes." "You've had this for 3 weeks." "Yes." She said it steadily. She was not going to flinch from the accounting of it. He looked at the letter on the table between them. He looked at the bank receipt next to it, the tight, painful, precisely managed bank receipt that they had spent the last 6 weeks engineering, counting every dollar, selling the steers, adjusting the feed costs, working the numbers from every angle to hit a figure that was now, it turned out, entirely unnecessary. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Because I needed to think," she said. "About what it meant. About what I wanted to do with it. About—" She stopped, tried again. "I've been left with nothing twice. Once by death, and once by a family that decided I wasn't worth keeping. I wanted to be certain before I said it out loud that it was real, that it wasn't going to be taken back. 3 weeks is a long time to be certain," he said. "I know." He stood up from the table, not in anger, not quite, but he needed to not be sitting down. He went to the window and looked out at the dark yard and the darker land beyond it. 3 weeks. She had sat at this table with him, had worked the numbers with him, had watched him make the decision to sell the steers, had let him make the October payment with money they'd ground out of the ranch by sheer calculation and restraint. And she had known, the whole time, that the number in that letter made all of it unnecessary. He understood why. He heard what she'd said, and he understood the shape of it. The woman who'd been stripped of everything twice, who needed to be sure of something before she said it out loud, who had learned that things you counted on had a way of being taken back. He understood it from the inside because he was a man who had made the same calculation about different things for years. He understood it, and it still sat in him wrong. "This is the thing I need to know," he said, still at the window. "Are you staying because you're choosing to stay? Or are you staying because the money just came through and you haven't made up your mind yet?" Silence. He turned around. She was sitting very straight. Her hands were flat on the table on either side of the letter. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated in ways he couldn't fully read, something between hurt and resolve, something that was working to be honest rather than defensive. "I know why you're asking that," she said, "and I know why it's fair, but I need you to hear this. I was not going to leave. The money doesn't change that. I didn't answer your letter because I had nowhere else to go. I answered it because it was honest and this place needed someone who could do something useful in it, and I'm someone who can do something useful." She paused. "I stayed because I wanted to stay. The money doesn't change that." "Then why didn't you tell me?" he said again. "Because I didn't know yet what I was going to do with it," she said. "And I didn't want to have a conversation about it until I did. Because the first question out of anyone's mouth was going to be, what are you going to do with it? And I needed to know my own answer first." He came back to the table. He did not sit down. He stood at the end of it and looked at her. "Do you know now?" he said. "Not entirely," she said. "I know part of it." "Tell me the part you know." She looked at him for a moment longer, steadying herself in the particular way that people do before they say something they've been building toward, without being sure of the reception. "I want to build a proper school," she said. "Not the back room. A real building, with space for all the children, and enough materials, and a teacher who doesn't have to improvise everything from borrowed books." She said it with a quietness that was not tentative but careful, the voice of someone who has decided to say a true thing and is saying it without decoration. "There are families out here who have nothing. Their children have nothing. I've been sitting with 10 children in a back room that used to store broken equipment, and they're learning, and that matters, but it's not enough." She paused. "I want to use the money for something that stays, something that doesn't go away when the next hard season comes." He sat down. He looked at the letter, and he looked at the bank receipt, and he looked at her face across the table, at the woman who had come here with one suitcase and had spent 4 months making things work that he hadn't been able to make work alone. And he thought about what she had just said, not, "I want to leave," not, "I want to take this money somewhere comfortable," but "I want to build a school." He said, "You could do that somewhere else, somewhere easier." "I could," she said. But the children here are the ones I know." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind moved across the dry land with a sound like paper. The lamp on the table threw a circle of yellow light around the two of them and left the rest of the kitchen in shadow. "I should have told you sooner," she said. "I know that. I'm not asking you to say it doesn't matter that I didn't." "It matters," he said. "I know. But I understand it," he said. "I don't like it, but I understand it." She let out a breath. Not relief, something steadier than relief, something that recognized the distinction between being forgiven and being understood. "What happens now?" she said. "Now you write back to the attorney," he said, "and we figure out the rest from there." She nodded. He picked up the bank receipt and put it in his shirt pocket, next to his heart, which was probably not a meaningful gesture, but which he noticed himself making. "The school," he said. "Where would you build it?" She blinked. She had not, apparently, expected to be there so quickly in the conversation. "I've been thinking about the parcel on the far side of the Renner property. It's central. Everyone could reach it within reasonable distance." "That parcel belongs to old Hawkins," he said. "He's been trying to sell it for 3 years." "I know," she said. "I spoke to him." He stared at her. She met his stare with the patient look of a woman who is accustomed to being ahead of the conversation by a step or two and has learned not to apologize for it. "I spoke to him last month," she said. "I said I was making inquiries on behalf of a possible future project. I didn't commit to anything." "You spoke to Hawkins last month," he said. "He said he'd take $200 for the parcel." $200 is a reasonable price," she said, "for what it is and where it sits." He rubbed the back of his neck. He thought about the fact that while he had been sleeping in this house and eating at this table and thinking of Clara Whitmore as someone who was learning the shape of this place, she had been, quietly, methodically, without announcement, making plans that extended beyond the kitchen and the back room and the supply ledger. He thought about it, and he was not, he discovered, irritated. He was something else, something that required a moment to identify. He was, he realized slowly, proud of her. It was a strange feeling. He hadn't felt proud of another person in a very long time. Pride in another person required a certain closeness, required that you were near enough to see what they were actually doing and invested enough to care about it. He had not been near enough to anyone for that in years. "I'll go talk to Hawkins with you," he said. She looked surprised, just slightly, a small shift around the eyes that she controlled quickly, but he caught it. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said, "but he'll take the offer more seriously if we come together." He paused. "And I'd like to be there." A moment passed between them, quiet and waited, carrying more than either of them put into words. "All right," she said. "Thank you." The town found out about the inheritance before the week was out. This was not surprising. Harlan Creek was a small place with few entertainments and a functional relationship with other people's business, and a woman who had arrived with one suitcase and was now sitting on a Whitmore estate settlement was not information that stayed private long. Ethan never established exactly how it got out, whether it was the attorney's letter or Hawkins mentioning the land inquiry to someone at the feed store, or simply the way that things get out in small places through a combination of overheard conversations and reasonable inference. But by Thursday morning of the following week, he could feel it when he walked into the dry goods store. The particular quality of people turning to look and then turning away. The way conversation shifted when he came close. Margaret Hollis, who ran the dry goods counter and had an opinion about everything and no compunction about sharing it, waited until he was at the back of the store before she said it, loudly enough that the two other women in the room could hear. "I suppose we'll be seeing less of Mrs. Cole now that she doesn't need the arrangement anymore." He turned around. Margaret was looking at him with an expression that was half pity and half something less kind. "I don't mean any disrespect, Ethan, but a woman with Whitmore money and a woman living on a struggling cattle ranch are two different propositions. People make practical decisions." He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the things he could say, the specific, accurate things that would defend Clara and the arrangement and the work they had done together over the past 4 months. He decided that defending Clara to Margaret Hollis was not something Clara would want him to do. Clara was perfectly capable of defending herself, and she was not a woman who needed a man to stand at a counter and make speeches on her behalf. He bought what he'd come for and left. But walking back to the wagon, he was aware of a cold feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with the October air. It was the feeling of someone who has heard an argument that he knows is wrong but cannot entirely push out of his head. Clara had stayed. She had said she was staying. She had talked about the school like someone making plans for a future that was rooted here, in this ground, in these children. But she had also kept the letter for 3 weeks. And the inheritance was real, and it was large, and it gave her options she had not had when she arrived. And people with options made choices that people without them couldn't afford to make. He told himself he trusted her. He did trust her. That was the problem. He had not expected to trust her, and now he did. And the discovery that he had let that happen was more frightening than the original wariness had been. He drove home without stopping to think too carefully about why. Clara was at the Gunderson farm when he got back. She had started going over once a week to help Agnes Renner's youngest with reading, and sometimes she stopped at the Gundersons on the way back. He did not see her until dinner, and at dinner she was quiet in a way that was different from her usual working quiet. He said, "Something happened." She set down her fork. "Margaret Hollis stopped by this afternoon." He said nothing. "She was polite about it," Clara said. "In the way that people are polite when they're trying to make sure you understand something they believe they're doing you a kindness by telling you." She paused. "She said the town was talking. She said people were saying I'd only married you because I needed a place to land, and now that I had money, I'd be going back to somewhere that suited me better." He looked at his plate. "And then she said something else," Clara said. He looked up. She said, Clara stopped. She was holding herself very still in the way that she held herself still when she was managing something she did not fully trust herself to say without it coming out wrong. She said she hoped I understood that some men couldn't afford to get attached to women who were only passing through. She said she hoped I'd been honest with you about my intentions. The kitchen was quiet. "She was talking about you," Clara said. She wasn't worried about me. He sat with this. He thought about Margaret Hollis, who was not a cruel woman, who had probably meant what she said as genuine concern, who had looked at the situation and seen something that frightened her on his behalf. He thought about the fact that Margaret Hollis had seen something in him that he was still in the process of identifying in himself. "What did you say to her?" he said. "I said my intentions were my own business, and Ethan Cole was not a man who needed other people worrying on his behalf." She paused. "And then I told her that the school was going to be built on the Hawkins parcel and that I expected the whole town to have an opinion about the curriculum and she might as well get hers in early." Something shifted in his face. He could feel it, a cracking open of something that had been held tight. "That was direct," he said. "She's a direct person," Clara said. "She responds to it." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Are you bothered by what they're saying?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I'm bothered by it the way you're bothered by something that's wrong and you can't fix it by arguing with it. The only thing that fixes it is time and evidence." "And if some people decide the evidence doesn't change their minds?" She looked at him across the table, and he saw in her face the particular tiredness of a woman who had spent a lifetime being assessed by people who had already decided what she was before she had a chance to show them otherwise. By the school board in Missouri, by Thomas's brother, by the Harlan Creek gossip chain that had drawn its conclusions in the week she arrived. "Then I build the school anyway," she said. He nodded. That was, he thought, probably all there was to say about it. But 3 days later, the situation got more complicated. The letter came from Kansas City, not from the attorney this time, from Thomas's brother, Gerald Whitmore himself. Ethan was in the barn when Clara brought it out to him, and she stood in the barn doorway in the same place she'd stood when she was angry about the South Field, except that this time she wasn't angry. She looked, for the first time since he'd known her, genuinely unsettled. She handed him the letter. He read it. Gerald Whitmore was contesting the inheritance. His argument, laid out in the neat, cold language of a man who had a lawyer write what he himself lacked the nerve to say directly, was that the late Elder Whitmore had been of diminished capacity in the final months of his life, and that the change to the will had been made under undue influence. Specifically, the letter implied under Clara's influence, despite the fact that Clara had had no contact with the Elder Whitmore in the 2 years since Thomas's death. It was a lie. It was a specific documented lie. The kind of lie that required paperwork to sustain itself, that would not survive exposure, but that could do damage in the time it took to expose it. Ethan handed the letter back. "He's wrong," he said. "He is wrong," Clara said. "But he has money to spend on lawyers, and I have money that isn't in my hands yet." "What does your attorney say?" "I haven't been able to reach him yet. I sent a telegram this morning." She was holding the letter at her side now, not looking at it. Gerald was always this way. He contested Thomas's original will on less grounds than this and nearly won, simply by drawing it out until I couldn't afford to keep fighting. She paused. "He knows I don't have resources yet. He's counting on me not having resources." Ethan thought about that. He thought about the school on the Hawkins parcel that didn't exist yet. He thought about the children in the back room with the borrowed books. He thought about the inheritance sitting in a Kansas City estate account, while Gerald Whitmore hired lawyers to make the case that Clara had manipulated an old man she hadn't seen in 2 years. "He doesn't know you have resources," he said. She looked at him. "He knows you were a widowed schoolteacher living on a struggling Montana ranch," Ethan said. He wrote that letter thinking he was writing it to that woman. A pause. Something moved across Clara's face, recognition, and behind it something harder and more determined. "He's not," she said. "No," Ethan said. "He's not." She straightened. It was a small movement, a squaring of the shoulders, a lifting of the chin, but it changed the quality of the air around her. She went from a woman holding an upsetting letter to a woman deciding what she was going to do about an upsetting letter, and in Ethan's experience, that was a significant transition. "I need to go to Kansas City," she said. "When?" "As soon as I can reach the attorney and understand what we're dealing with." She looked at him directly. "Will you come?" He held her gaze. This was not a simple question. Kansas City was 4 days by train. The ranch could not run without him for 4 days without serious risk during this part of the season. Going meant trusting Hector with decisions that Hector was capable of, but that Ethan had never, in 17 years, left to anyone else. Going also meant choosing, in a clear and visible way, whose side he was on. Not that there was any question in his own mind, but making it visible to the town, to Gerald Whitmore's lawyers, to whoever was watching. That was a different thing than knowing it privately. "Yes," he said. "I'll come." She nodded. Something in her face that was not quite gratitude, but was in the neighborhood of it. The acknowledgement that being stood beside was not nothing, and she knew it wasn't nothing. She went back to the house to send more telegrams. He stood in the barn alone and thought about the fact that 4 months ago he had written a cold, honest letter to a stranger about a practical arrangement, and now he was preparing to take a train to Kansas City to stand beside that stranger in a legal fight over money she'd been left by a family that had already wronged her once. He thought about the word stranger. He couldn't quite make it apply anymore. That night, he went to the fence line where he usually went when he needed to think without the house around him. The east fence line. The one he'd repaired himself 4 times. The one where he'd stood on the evening this whole thing started and counted what he had left to lose. He stood there in the dark and the cold and looked at the land and thought about what he was afraid of. He was afraid that Gerald Whitmore would win, not because the man was right, he wasn't right, but because wrong people with money and lawyers won things they shouldn't win all the time. And he had seen it happen. And the thought of Clara being stripped of something a second time by a man using legal machinery as a weapon made something in him go hard and cold. He was afraid of what the town was saying. Not for his sake. He had long since stopped caring what Harlan Creek thought of him personally. But for hers, because she had built something here in 4 months that most people didn't build in years, and he didn't want to see it eroded by other people's stories about who she was. And underneath both of those fears, sitting quieter and deeper than either of them, he was afraid of something he still didn't entirely have language for. The fear of a man who has realized, too late to do anything sensible about it, that he has let someone become necessary. He had told himself to be careful. He had been wrong about being careful. He stood at the fence line in the dark and the cold and admitted it, finally, to no one but himself and the indifferent Montana sky. He had fallen in love with his wife. The word arrived without ceremony, without the romantic architecture he might have expected if he'd been a different kind of man. It arrived the way most true things arrived when he finally let himself see them, plainly, without ornament, too solid to argue with. He stood with it for a while. Then he went inside because the cold was getting serious and there were telegrams to send and train schedules to look at and a fight that needed preparing for. And love was not a thing that excused you from the work in front of you. That was something Clara had taught him in the months since she arrived. You did not stop working because things got hard. You did not stop working because the stakes got higher. You adjusted what you were working toward, and you worked. He went inside and sat at the kitchen table and started making a list of everything they would need to take to Kansas City, and did not say anything to Clara about the fence line or what he'd figured out standing there, because some things you held until the right moment, and this was not yet the right moment. But it was closer than it had been. They took the morning train out of Harlan Creek on a Thursday, which meant Ethan had 2 days to prepare Hector for everything that might go wrong in his absence, and Hector had 2 days to pretend he wasn't nervous about it. The preparation happened in the barn on Wednesday evening, the two of them going through the list of decisions that might need to be made before Ethan got back. The water schedule, the question of the north fence post that had been leaning since September, what to do if the weather turned before the remaining hay was in the dry shed. Hector listened to all of it with his arms crossed and his expression neutral, which was how Hector listened to everything, and at the end of it he said, "How long?" 5 days, Ethan said. "Maybe 6. Hector nodded. "We'll be here. If anything goes seriously wrong, I've been on this ranch 11 years, Hector said. I know what to do." Ethan looked at him. "I know," he said. "I'm saying it anyway." "You always say things anyway," Hector said without heat. "That's all right. Go do what you need to do." It was the closest thing to a blessing Hector was going to give, and Ethan took it. Clara spent Wednesday evening writing letters to Agnes Renner, explaining that the school would be paused for the week, and to Marta Gunderson separately, because Marta was 11 and did not respond well to hearing things secondhand. She also wrote to the attorney in Kansas City, a man named Aldous Freer, who had been handling the Whitmore estate and who had, in his last telegram, managed to convey both professional reassurance and personal alarm in the same 8 words. Contest is procedurally weak, but timing is their weapon. Come soon. Ethan read that telegram over her shoulder and said nothing. He thought a great deal. The train left at 6:40 in the morning. They rode the first hour without talking much, which was not unusual for them, and which on this particular morning felt less like comfortable silence and more like two people who had things to say and were waiting for the right moment to say them. The landscape outside the window was flat and brown, and going by too fast to look at for long, and the car they were in smelled of coal smoke and the particular dry warmth of confined spaces in cold weather. Clara had the attorney's letters in a leather document case on her lap. She had read them 3 times already that Ethan had seen, and probably more times when he wasn't watching. Her left hand rested on the case in a way that was not quite gripping it, but was not entirely relaxed either. He said, "Tell me what Freer thinks the weak points are." She looked at him. She had been expecting, he thought, to spend the train ride managing her own thoughts. The question redirected her in a way she seemed to appreciate. Gerald's claim is that the elder Whitmore, his father, lacked testamentary capacity when he changed the will, she said. That he was confused, possibly manipulated. The problem for Gerald is that he hasn't got any real evidence of this because there wasn't any confusion. Freer was there when the will was changed. He says the elder Whitmore was as clear as a man can be. Then it should be straightforward, Ethan said. It should be, she said. But Gerald is going to call witnesses who say the old man was declining. He has family members who will say what he needs them to say. And even if Freer dismantles every one of them on the stand, the process takes time. And Gerald knows time is expensive. She paused. The first time he did this, with Thomas's will, he didn't win on the merits. He won because I ran out of money to fight him. Ethan thought about that. He thought about a younger Clara. Not so different from the woman sitting next to him, he suspected. Same spine, same clear eyes, sitting across from a man with lawyers and watching the money run out while the clock ran. He doesn't know what you have now, Ethan said. No, she said. He wrote that letter thinking he was writing to a woman with nothing. Good, Ethan said. Let him keep thinking that until we're in the room. She turned to look at him fully. Something in his tone had shifted. Not harder, exactly, but more deliberate. The way he got when he'd made a decision and was now simply executing it. You've been in legal situations before, she said. Land disputes, he said. 3 of them over the East Quarter over the past 10 years. The neighbor on that side, Sir Denton, tried twice to claim the boundary line ran 20 feet further than the survey showed. Both times the same thing. Lawyers, delays, trying to make it expensive enough that I'd settle for less than what was mine. What did you do? I didn't settle, he said, and I made sure he understood I wasn't going to. He looked out the window. Men like that, like Denton, like Gerald Whitmore, they're not counting on being right. They're counting on you being tired. I'm not tired, Clara said. I know, he said. Make sure he knows it too. Kansas City was larger and louder than either of them talked about, but Clara had been there before, for the original probate of Thomas's will, for 2 subsequent court appearances that had gone badly, and she moved through the station with the efficiency of someone navigating familiar, unpleasant territory. Ethan stayed close, not in front of her, not steering her, beside her, which was where he was supposed to be. Aldous Freer met them at the hotel. He was a small, precise man in his 60s with the kind of face that gave nothing away by default and had to make a visible effort to appear warm. He shook Ethan's hand, nodded at Clara, and immediately sat them down in the hotel's small parlor and opened his own case of documents. Gerald filed the formal contest yesterday morning, Freer said, without preamble. We're scheduled for a preliminary hearing before Judge Calloway on Monday. That gives us 3 days. What does he need to prove at the preliminary hearing? Clara said. Enough to warrant a full evidentiary hearing, Freer said, which is a lower bar. He's going to argue diminished capacity and undue influence. The undue influence claim is the more serious one. It implies you were in contact with the elder Whitmore and manipulating his decisions. I had no contact with him, Clara said. None. Thomas died and his family made it clear I was not welcome, and I respected that and stayed away. I know that, Freer said, and I believe you. The question is what evidence exists to demonstrate it. He looked at her. Letters, any correspondence that demonstrates the lack of contact. Anyone who can testify that the elder Whitmore spoke of his own decision independently, without any suggestion from you. Clara was quiet for a moment. Ethan watched her working through it, the same focused inward calculation he had seen her apply to the ranch ledger. His housekeeper, she said, Mrs. Aldgate. She was with him for 20 years. If he spoke to anyone about his decision, he spoke to her. She paused. She was always kind to me when Thomas was alive. She sent a condolence note when he died. She may be willing to speak. Freer wrote this down. Anyone else? Dr. Harmon, in Kansas City. He was the elder Whitmore's physician. If there was a question of capacity, he'd be the one who'd know. I'll pursue both, Freer said. He looked at Ethan. And you? Your role here, Mr. Cole? Her husband, Ethan said, flatly, without qualification. Freer looked at him for a moment in the assessing way of a man who makes his living reading people. Gerald's attorneys may try to characterize the marriage as part of a pattern of opportunistic relationships, he said. It's a reach, but let them try, Ethan said. Freer held his gaze for another moment. Then he made a note and moved on. The 3 days before the hearing were not idle days. Freer located Mrs. Aldgate, who was now working for a family in the east part of the city, and Clara went to see her alone, which she had insisted on. She came back 2 hours later and said that Mrs. Aldgate would speak. She said it quietly, with the particular look of someone who has just been surprised by kindness from a direction they hadn't expected, and Ethan did not ask her what had been said. He could see enough of it in her face. Freer tracked down Dr. Harmon, who was retired but had maintained his records and was, as Freer reported it, distinctly unimpressed by the Whitmore family's legal maneuvers, having witnessed several of them over the years. He agreed to provide a written statement regarding the elder Whitmore's capacity at the time of the will change. His statement, when it arrived, was 6 pages long and left no room for ambiguity. Gerald Whitmore's attorneys, Ethan learned through Freer, had anticipated a woman with a local attorney and limited resources. They had prepared for a certain kind of fight. What they had not prepared for was Aldous Freer, who was not a local attorney and did not have limited resources. On Saturday evening, in the hotel's small dining room, Claire put down her fork and said, "You haven't said much the last 2 days." "I've been listening," he said. "What are you thinking?" He considered how to answer that honestly. "I'm thinking that Gerald Whitmore has been doing this his whole life," he said, "taking things from people who don't have the position to push back. And I'm thinking he doesn't know yet that you're not that person anymore." She looked at him across the small table. The dining room was nearly empty at this hour, and the light in it was low and yellow, and she looked tired in a specific way. Not the exhaustion of the harvest, which was physical and had a clear end, but the exhaustion of sustained alertness, of being ready every moment for the next development. "I'm angry," she said. It came out simply, without performance. "I've been angry since that letter arrived. I didn't say it because there wasn't room for it. There was too much to do, but I'm angry." "That's reasonable," he said. "He took the farm," she said. "He took everything Thomas had built, and he used lawyers to do it, and it was wrong, and nobody stopped him." She was not loud about it. She was the particular kind of angry that lives in a low, even voice. "I don't want a settlement. I want what was left to me. I want every part of it, because the elder Whitmore had the right to leave it to me, and he did, and Gerald Whitmore doesn't get to take it because he can afford lawyers." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Then don't settle," he said. "Freer says a settlement might be faster." "Freer thinks faster is better," Ethan said. "You get to decide what's better." He held her gaze. "Don't settle. See it through." She looked at him for a long moment. "If it goes to a full evidentiary hearing, it could take months," she said. "I know. The school would be delayed." "I know. And you'd be—" She stopped, reorganized. "You'd have to manage the ranch through another season mostly alone." "Hector's better than he lets on," Ethan said, "and I'll be there." She was silent. Her hands were flat on the table, and she was looking at him with an expression he had seen before. The expression of a woman who was measuring something, doing the real accounting of it. "Why?" she said. The question was direct and deserved a direct answer. "Because you're right," he said, "and because what's right should win." He paused. "And because I don't want to watch another man take something from you." The dining room was very quiet. She said, "Ethan." "I know," he said. "Not now. There's a hearing Monday." He looked at his plate. "But I wanted you to know why." She was quiet for what felt like a long time. When he looked up, she was still looking at him, with something in her face that was not yet resolved. Too complicated, too real, too much wrapped up in a moment that already had too much in it. "After Monday," she said. "After Monday," he agreed. The preliminary hearing was at 9 in the morning in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and coal heat, and the particular dry staleness of a room where difficult things were said on a regular basis. Gerald Whitmore was already seated when they arrived, with 2 attorneys, and he was a larger man than Ethan had imagined, broad-shouldered, florid, dressed in the kind of clothing that was expensive in a way that wanted to be noticed. He looked at Clara when she came in with the examining attention of a man assessing a problem. He looked at Ethan with less attention, which was a miscalculation. The hearing was preliminary, which meant the arguments were procedural and the evidence was limited, but it mattered. If Gerald's attorneys could demonstrate sufficient grounds for a full hearing, the process would drag into the following year. Freer had been clear about this. The preliminary hearing was where it needed to be stopped, or the cost of stopping it later would be significantly higher in every sense. Gerald's lead attorney, a man named Cheswick, was smooth and practiced in the way of men who had made their careers out of making lies sound like reasonable uncertainties. He presented Gerald's case in measured, qualified language, not claiming Clara had manipulated the elder Whitmore, but suggesting it, raising it as a possibility, using the phrase questions remained so frequently that by the 3rd time, Ethan had to make a deliberate effort to keep his expression neutral. Freer dismantled it methodically. He entered Dr. Harmon's statement first. 6 pages, signed and witnessed, establishing that the elder Whitmore had been examined 4 months before the will change, and again 2 months after, and that in both examinations his cognitive function was entirely consistent with a man of his age and health. Sharp, oriented, capable of complex decision-making. Cheswick objected to the statement on procedural grounds. Judge Calloway overruled him in a tone that suggested he found the objection unpersuasive and mildly irritating. Then Freer called Mrs. Aldgate. She was a small, upright woman in her 60s, with white hair and the careful dignity of someone who has spent a lifetime in service and has opinions about things that she keeps largely to herself. She sat in the witness position and answered Freer's questions with the precise, unadorned language of a person who does not see the need to embellish what is already true. She had been present, she said, on the day the elder Whitmore had spoken to his attorney about changing the will. She had brought them tea and remained in the adjacent room. She had heard the elder Whitmore say, clearly and without prompting, that he believed his son Thomas's wife had been wronged by the original disposition and that he wished to correct that wrong before he died. He had said, and here Mrs. Aldgate paused and looked at Clara, and something passed between them that the courtroom was not fully privy to. He had said, Clara was a good wife to my Thomas, and she deserved better than what this family gave her. I want that on the record before I go. The courtroom was quiet. Clara was looking at the table in front of her. Her jaw was set. Her hands were folded. Ethan was watching Gerald Whitmore, who was doing the thing that people do when they hear testimony that dismantles their position. He was looking at his own attorney and waiting to be told it was going to be all right. And Cheswick was writing something on a piece of paper and not meeting his eye. Cheswick cross-examined Mrs. Aldgate for 20 minutes and got nothing useful from it, because Mrs. Aldgate had been answering difficult questions from difficult people for 40 years and had long since stopped being rattled by them. She was polite and consistent and immovable, and when Cheswick finally released her, she stood, smoothed her dress, and walked out of the courtroom with the bearing of a woman who had done what she came to do. Judge Calloway took a recess. He was back in 25 minutes. His ruling was direct. Gerald Whitmore's petition for a full evidentiary hearing was denied. The estate would proceed to settlement according to the original amended will. If Gerald Whitmore wished to file a new petition, he was entitled to do so. But based on the evidence presented today, the court found insufficient grounds to delay the settlement further. Cheswick stood up and said something about reserving the right to appeal. Judge Calloway said the right was noted, and then it was over. The walk out of the courtroom was not triumphant. That was not how it felt. And Ethan noticed that Clara was not pretending it was triumphant, which was one of the things he respected about her. She walked out beside Freer and they spoke in low voices about the next steps, the formal settlement timeline, the transfer of funds, the paperwork that would need to happen in a specific order, and her voice was steady and focused, and exactly what it needed to be. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Gerald Whitmore walked past them. He didn't speak. He looked at Clara for a moment, and it was a complicated look. Not concession, not apology, something harder and less clean than either of those. And then he looked at Ethan in the way that men look at one another when they are acknowledging that a thing has been settled, and then he went through the door at the end of the hallway and was gone. Freer excused himself to deal with filing, and for a moment Ethan and Clara were standing alone in the corridor with the old wood paneling and the coal smoke warmth and the distant sound of the city outside. She let out a breath. It was a long breath, the kind that has been held for 3 weeks and has finally found permission to release. "It's not fully done," she said. "The settlement still takes time." "I know," he said. "Gerald could still file again." "He could," Ethan said. "He won't. Men like that don't spend money on losing positions twice." She looked at him. "He knows now," Ethan said. "He knows you're not the woman he wrote that letter to. He'll find someone else to push around." She was quiet for a moment, then very quietly, "Mrs. Aldgate took a risk, coming here. She still works for families in this city. Gerald has connections." "She did it anyway," he said. "She did it anyway," Clara said. She was looking at something in the middle distance, working through something. "The elder Whitmore said he wanted it on the record. Before he went." She paused. "I didn't know he felt that way. We barely spoke after Thomas died. I assumed he sided with Gerald. That's how it seemed. I didn't know he was carrying it." Ethan thought about what it would be like to carry something like that. The knowledge that you'd allowed a wrong, watching it happen, and then spending the last of your life trying to correct it in the only way still available to you. "He did what he could do," Ethan said, "when he could do it." She looked at him. He saw something in her face that was open in a way that it wasn't always open. The fatigue of the last 3 days had worn away some of the usual careful management. "You said last night, at dinner," she started. "I know what I said," he said. "I want to—" She stopped. The corridor was not entirely empty. A clerk was passing at the far end, and a pair of attorneys were coming in from outside. "Not here. Not here," he agreed. They took the early train back the following morning, having spent Monday evening settling the immediate paperwork with Freer and sharing a meal that was quieter than Saturday's had been. Not uncomfortably quiet, but the quiet of two people who have said something real and are letting it settle before they say more. The train back was 4 days, with one change in Billings. The landscape ran in reverse past the windows, flat to rolling, brown to browner, the particular emptiness of the high frontier that Ethan had stopped seeing years ago because it was simply where he lived, and the extraordinary becomes ordinary when you live inside it long enough. Clara slept for the first 2 hours out of Kansas City. He watched her sleep the way you watch people sleep when you have not had much occasion to. The complete dropping of guard that sleep required, the face gone slack, younger looking. She had a small frown line between her brows, even in sleep. He thought that was probably information about how much she carried and how little of it she put down. When she woke, she looked at him without the usual morning adjustment period, clear-eyed in a way that suggested she'd been closer to waking than to deep sleep. "You should have slept too," she said. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" He looked out the window for a moment. The land was going by, flat and honest. "About the ranch," he said. "About what it looked like when you arrived. What it looks like now." She waited. "I've been so focused on what was wrong with it," he said. That I couldn't see what was possible. You saw it. He turned back to her. You saw it when I couldn't. I saw it from the outside, she said. That's easier. Maybe, he said. But you didn't have to stay. You could have come, seen it wasn't what you hoped, and found a way out. There wasn't a way out at the start, she said. I had one suitcase and a letter. There was always a way out, he said. For a woman like you, you would have found one. He held her gaze. You stayed because you chose to. I know that now. A pause. The train moved through the flat brown distance. I told you I stayed, she said. You told me, he said. And I believed you and didn't believe you at the same time. That's on me, not on you. He paused. I had a habit of waiting for things to leave. It made me slow to understand when something was choosing to stay. She was very still. Clara, he said, I meant what I said Saturday. I want to say it properly, without a hearing on Monday hanging over it. She looked at him. Whatever composure she was maintaining had gotten quieter, less defended. This started as a practical arrangement he set up. That was honest. It was what I had to offer, and I said so. And you accepted it on those terms, and I think we both meant it when we agreed to it. He paused. I don't know exactly when it stopped being only that. I noticed it stopping, but I couldn't say precisely when. He looked at his hands. I'm not good at this. I should say that first. I know you're not good at this, she said softly. Keep going. He looked at her. Something in her tone, not impatient, not teasing, just honest, made the thing easier to say. I love you, he said. I'm not good at saying it, and I don't know that I'll get much better at saying it. But I want you to know it because you deserve to know true things, and that is the truest one I have. The train went on through the empty miles. Clara looked at him for a long moment, and he saw in her face the full weight of everything she was. The woman who had answered a cold, honest letter because honesty was what she was hungry for. The woman who had rebuilt a dying ranch one practical decision at a time. The woman who had carried a 3-week secret not from deception, but from the hard-learned habit of a person who had been promised things and watched them vanish. I love you too, she said. I've been trying not to for approximately 2 months. He almost smiled. It was not a thing that came easily to his face, the smile, but it was there. How did that go? He said. Badly, she said. I'm not good at it either. He reached across the space between them and took her hand, not dramatically, the way you hand something to someone who needs it, steady and without ceremony. She let him hold it and turned it slightly so their hands settled together properly. They sat like that for a long time, with the frontier going by outside, brown and vast and indifferent, and the train taking them back to the place they had, between the two of them, begun to make into something neither of them had been entirely expecting. The ranch was intact when they got back. Hector met them at the wagon with the expression of a man who has successfully managed a difficult week and is not going to make a speech about it. North fence is done, he said. Hay's in. The Gunderson girl came by twice asking when the school was starting again. Monday, Clara said. Hector nodded and went back to the barn. Ethan stood in the yard and looked at the house, the sagging porch railing that Clara had rebuilt in October, the kitchen garden that had gone from a dead patch to a real thing, the window on the south side that he had finally replaced last month, proper glass, because the board had bothered him every time he saw it and he had finally stopped tolerating it. Clara stood beside him. It looks different than it did, he said. It is different, she said. So are you. He thought about that. He thought about the man who had stood at this fence in late summer counting what he had left to lose. A shorter list, he'd thought then. He thought about what was on the list now and how the length of it had changed without him doing anything that felt deliberate, just the daily work of being less alone than he'd been. The school, he said. When do you want to talk to Hawkins? This week, she said. Before he changes his mind or someone else asks. Wednesday, he said. We'll go Wednesday. She nodded. And then she picked up her bag and walked up the porch steps and into the house. And the door did not close all the way behind her, left slightly open, the way you leave a door when you're inside and you know someone is coming in after you. He stood in the yard for another moment. Then he followed her in. Old Hawkins took the offer on a Wednesday morning, same as Ethan had predicted, in the way that men who have been trying to sell something for 3 years take an offer when it finally comes with real money behind it. Quickly, without haggling, with the particular relief of someone setting down a weight they'd forgotten they were still carrying. He signed the paper at his kitchen table and shook Clara's hand and then Ethan's, and then he said to no one in particular, "Going to be good to see something built on that parcel. It's been empty too long." Clara said, "It won't be empty much longer." They drove back to the ranch in the cold November air, with the signed paper in the document case and the particular quiet of two people who have just done something that cannot be undone and are sitting with the reality of it. The Hawkins parcel was real now. The school was real now. Not the back room with borrowed books, not a plan on paper, but a piece of ground with a deed changing hands and a purpose attached to it. Ethan glanced at her as he drove. She was looking at the road ahead with an expression he had learned to read over the past 5 months. Not contentment, because contentment was too passive a word for what Clara Whitmore felt about things she was building. It was more like the expression of someone who has aimed at something for a long time and has just seen the first evidence that the aim was true. "You'll need a builder," he said. "I have 2 in mind," she said. "The Reese brothers, out near Caldwell. Hector says they do good work and they're not expensive." "Hector's been talking to you about builders?" "Hector talks to me about more than you think," she said, in a tone that was not smug, but was somewhere in that neighborhood. He filed this away. He had been discovering in increments over 5 months that the ranch existed on 2 different levels of communication simultaneously, the one he was part of and the one Clara had been quietly building on her own, through the school and the neighbors and the particular sideways conversations that women on the frontier carried on with the reliable economy of people who had learned that direct requests were not always the most efficient route. The Reese brothers came out the following week, looked at the Hawkins parcel, and quoted a price that was fair. Clara negotiated them down on the lumber cost, not dramatically, enough to be worth doing, and the Reese brothers left with a contract and appeared, in the way of men who have just been hired by someone who knows what they want, slightly more energized than when they'd arrived. The foundation work started in the last week of November, which was not ideal timing. The ground in Montana in late November had opinions about being broken, but Clara had decided that waiting until spring meant losing 4 months of potential teaching time, and she had a way of framing impractical decisions as the only practical ones available, which Ethan had learned was distinct from stubbornness. He helped when he could. Not the skilled carpentry work, that was the Reese brothers' domain, but the heavy labor, the moving of materials, the kind of sustained physical effort that he was built for and that gave him something to do with his hands while his mind worked through other things. One evening in early December, working late on the framing with the Reese brothers while Clara was inside finishing the school day with the children, the older Reese brother, a man named Cal, who had the broad, quiet competence of someone who had built things all his life, said, "Your wife designed the layout herself?" "She did," Ethan said. Cal nodded, looking at the framing. "Smart layout. More windows than I'd have thought to put in, but she's right about the light. Kids learn better in good light." Ethan looked at the window frames, the careful spacing of them, the way the design opened the room toward the south where the winter sun would come in longest. "She thinks about things like that," he said. "I can tell," Cal said. And then he went back to the work without making anything more of it, which was the right thing to do. The formal settlement of the Whitmore estate came through in the 3rd week of December. Freer sent a telegram, and then a letter, and the letter was dry and procedural and full of figures and dates, and Clara read it at the kitchen table with the same careful attention she gave everything she read, going through it twice before she set it down. "It's done," she said. Ethan was at the stove. He turned around. "Gerald filed a notice of appeal," she said. "Freer says it's procedurally empty. He doesn't have grounds and he knows it. He's doing it to be difficult and it won't go anywhere." "So it's done," Ethan said. "It's done," she confirmed. He poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them to the table and sat down, and they drank their coffee in the quiet of the December kitchen, and outside the window the land was white now, the first real snow of the season having come down 3 days ago and stayed, and the Hawkins parcel, their school parcel, was covered in it, the framing standing in white like a thing being revealed rather than buried. There was no celebration, because they were not people who celebrated the resolution of things that should have been straightforward to begin with, and had only been difficult because someone with money had decided to make them difficult. What they did instead was sit with the coffee and let the reality of the settled thing have its proper weight. Clara said, "I want to set up the education fund before the new year." He had known this was coming. She had mentioned it, obliquely, in the way she mentioned things that she had decided but wasn't yet ready to present as decided, twice in the past month. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. She had thought it through. He could tell, listening to her lay it out, that she had been thinking it through for weeks. The structure of it, the amount she intended to set aside, the way it would be administered. Not by her alone, and not by the county, which she did not entirely trust to do it right, but by a small board of community members. Agnes Renner, who had shown herself to be a woman of practical good sense. Old Hawkins, who knew the land and the families on it, and Marta Gunderson's father, who had initially been skeptical of the school and had, over the months, become one of its quieter advocates. "Marta's father?" Ethan said. "He changed his mind," Clara said. "People who change their minds are useful. They understand both sides." He thought about that. It was the kind of observation that sounded simple and was not. The fund was structured to support families who couldn't afford school materials, to pay a teacher's salary when Clara's informal arrangement needed to formalize, and to maintain the building itself over time. She was putting in enough to make it sustainable for 20 years without depending on donations that might not come. "And the rest?" he said. She looked at him. "The rest is ours." He held her gaze. The word ours had a different weight than it might have had 6 months ago. 6 months ago, it would have been a practical designation. Now it was something else. "You don't have to," he started. "I know I don't have to," she said. "The ranch is yours, Ethan. I'm not under any illusion that a piece of paper makes it otherwise. But I've been working in it for 5 months, and I plan to keep working in it, and I'd like to stop pretending that the money is separate from the life." She paused. "Unless you'd prefer to keep them separate." He thought about this honestly. He thought about what it would mean, practically, financially, in terms of the bank and the debt and the future of a place he had almost lost and had, with her beside him, begun to actually believe in again. He thought about what it would mean in the other way too, the way that wasn't about money. "No," he said. "I don't prefer that." She nodded, like it was settled, because it was. The school opened on the 6th of January, which was a Monday, which Clara said was the only correct day to open a school on because starting things on Mondays established the right habits from the beginning. The Reese brothers had finished the work 3 days before the new year, and the building was not large. 2 rooms, one for the younger children and one for the older ones, with a wood stove in each and the south-facing windows that Cal Reese had installed with evident personal investment in getting them right. 14 children came on the first day. Ethan stood at the edge of the yard and watched them arrive in the cold January morning, some alone, some with a parent who stood at the door for a moment before going back to their farm, and he felt something in his chest that he did not try to name precisely, because naming it too exactly would have made it smaller than it was. Clara was at the door of the school, greeting each child by name, which none of them expected, and all of them visibly responded to, in the way that children respond to being known. A straightening, a small illumination, the physical evidence of being seen by someone who matters. Agnes Renner came over to stand beside Ethan. She had driven over from her farm with her youngest, and now the youngest was inside, and Agnes was standing in the cold with her arms crossed, watching. "She built this," Agnes said. Not a question. "She did," Ethan said. "She built a lot of things," Agnes said. She said it in the thoughtful way of someone making an assessment they've been working toward for some time. "When she first came here, I wasn't sure. I'll say that honestly." "I wasn't sure either," Ethan said. Agnes looked at him sideways. "You didn't show it." "I was too busy to show it," he said. Agnes made a sound that might have been a laugh. She went inside to say goodbye to her daughter, and Ethan stayed in the yard a moment longer, looking at the school building in the winter light. Solid, simple, exactly the right size, nothing wasted. He thought about the letter he had written 8 months ago. The cold, honest letter. "I cannot promise romance. This is a partnership, nothing more." He had meant it when he wrote it. He had meant it the way a man means a thing when he has given up on the alternatives and is trying to be decent about it. He had been wrong about what a partnership was. He had thought partnership meant division of labor, complementary functions, a rational arrangement between people who needed something from each other. He had not understood that the other thing, the thing that grew in the margins of the practical, in the dinner conversations and the arguments and the evenings on the porch and the train ride back from Kansas City, was not a separate thing from the partnership. It was what the partnership became when two people did it honestly and for long enough. He went inside to start the morning work, because the land did not care that it was a significant day, and the cattle needed feeding regardless of what was happening in the new school building on the Hawkins parcel. The second blow came in February, and it came from a direction neither of them had been watching. A man named Sutter, who owned the large property north of the Cole Ranch and who had been in a quiet land dispute with the county over water rights for most of the previous year, had apparently decided to resolve his water problem by redirecting a secondary channel that ran through the northern edge of Ethan's property. He had done it quietly over the winter, while the ground was frozen and the change wasn't immediately visible. Cut a new channel that diverted water from the Cole Ranch's north irrigation source and sent it toward his own eastern field. Ethan discovered it on a February morning when he walked the north fence line and found the ground wrong. The channel was lower than it should have been, the banks newly disturbed in a way that the winter hadn't made. Too recent, too deliberate. He followed the disturbance north to where it crossed onto Sutter's land and found the new cut, obvious once you knew what you were looking for. He stood and looked at it for a long moment. He came back to the house and told Clara, who listened without interrupting, and then said, "How much water does it cost us?" "Enough to matter in spring," he said. "The north field depends on that channel. If the flow is reduced the way he's cut it, we'll be short for the summer planting." "Do you have the original water rights documentation?" she said. He did. He had been meticulous about documentation after the Denton disputes, every boundary survey, every water rights filing, every county record that pertained to the ranch. Clara had reorganized the filing system in September, and now it was organized in a way that actually made sense rather than the accumulative chaos it had been before. They found the relevant documents in 20 minutes. "This is clear," she said, reading through them. "The water rights on that channel are filed with the county in your name. What he did is not legal." "No," Ethan said. "It's not." "Have you spoken to him?" "Not yet." She looked at him. "Do you want to?" He thought about it. He thought about what Sutter was counting on. The old calculus. The one that men like Denton and Gerald Whitmore and Sutter all ran. That the other person would be too tired or too short of resources or too afraid of the cost to push back. That the path of least resistance was to absorb the wrong quietly and move on. "I'll go see him," Ethan said. "Today." "I'll come," Clara said. He looked at her. "You have the documents," she said. "I know where everything is, and two people are harder to dismiss than one." He did not argue. She was right, and he had learned over 8 months of daily evidence that when Clara said she was going to do a thing, it was not a request for permission. They drove to Sutter's place that afternoon. Sutter was a large, self-satisfied man who had the frontier rancher's particular belief that the world accommodated itself to whatever he decided was true, and he received them in his yard with the expression of a man who has been expecting a conversation and has already decided how it ends. He denied it, not with any sophistication, just flatly, with the confidence of a man who believes denial is sufficient when the alternative is inconvenient. Clara opened the document case on the side of the wagon without saying anything and laid out 3 pieces of paper. The original water rights filing, the county survey, and a document she had obtained, apparently, from the county clerk's office the previous week, a copy of Sutter's own property filing that showed his legal boundaries and the course of the channel as it had been registered. Sutter looked at the papers. "That's not how water rights work up here," he said, but his voice had changed. "It's exactly how water rights work," Clara said. The county clerk confirmed it. "I spoke to him Thursday." She paused. "You can put the channel back the way it was, or we file with the county next week. Either way, the channel goes back." Sutter looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. He had found over the years that silence was its own kind of pressure when deployed at the right moment. Sutter looked back at Clara, at the papers, at the particular quality of a woman who had just come from a courtroom in Kansas City where she had beaten a better resourced adversary on the merits. and who was currently extending him the courtesy of a private resolution before making it a public record. "I'll have my man look at it," Sutter said. "By end of the week," Clara said. Not a question. Sutter said, "End of the week." They drove back in the afternoon light, and Ethan said, about a mile from home, "You got the county clerk's document last week." "Thursday," she said. "You knew about the channel before I found it this morning." She was quiet for a beat. "I noticed something off about the north flow 2 weeks ago," she said. "I didn't say anything because I wanted to be sure before I raised it, and I wanted the documentation in hand first." He processed this. 2 weeks ago. She had noticed something off about the north water flow, had gone quietly to the county clerk, had obtained the relevant documentation, and had said nothing to him until he came to her with it himself. "You could have told me," he said. "I know," she said. "I was trying to not alarm you before I had something concrete." A pause. Was that wrong? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he knew how to think about things she asked him directly. "No," he said, "but tell me next time, even if it's not concrete yet." "All right," she said, "even if it's not concrete yet." Sutter's man restored the channel by Friday. Spring came slowly, the way Montana spring always came. Not as an arrival, but as a gradual reduction of hostility, the cold letting go by degrees, the ground softening from the bottom up in a way you could feel before you could see. The North Field, with its channel restored and the rotation Clara had suggested back in October now, in its second season, showed early growth that was visibly better than the previous year. Hector, walking the field with Ethan in late April, said, "Different." "Yes," Ethan said, "going to be a better year." "Looks like it." Hector nodded. He looked at the field for another moment. Then he said, "She figured the rotation." "She suggested it," Ethan said. "I implemented it." Hector gave him the look of a man who finds a distinction technically accurate and practically meaningless. He went back to work. The school by April had 17 children. Clara had hired a woman named Dorothy Strand, who had been a teacher in Billings before her husband's job had brought them out to the frontier, and who had been quietly going spare without work to take the younger class 3 days a week. This had been Clara's idea, funded by the Education Trust, and Dorothy Strand had accepted the position with the particular gratitude of a woman who has been underused for too long and knows it. It meant that Clara had, for the first time since she arrived, something that resembled a partial day off on the 3 days Dorothy taught. She used these days to do the things she had been fitting in the margins of everything else. A long visit with Agnes Renner, a morning at the county clerk's office reviewing the water rights registry more broadly, a day spent with the ranch ledger doing the longer analysis she'd wanted to do since December. On one of these days, Ethan came in from the field at noon to find her at the kitchen table with the ledger and a cup of cold tea and an expression of focused concentration, and he made fresh tea and set it next to her without interrupting, and she reached over and squeezed his hand briefly without looking up, and he went back to work. He thought about that moment for the rest of the afternoon. The ease of it. The way it had required nothing from either of them. No explanation, no acknowledgement, just the small, accurate knowledge of what another person needed and the instinct to provide it. He had not known this was possible. Not for him, specifically. He had thought, in the years after Ruth, that what he was capable of had been used up, not from cruelty, just from the accumulated weight of grief and isolation, and the particular way that years of carrying everything alone calcified a man into self-sufficiency as a defense against needing anything he might not be able to keep. He had been wrong about that. Clara had not fixed it, exactly. He was still not a man who talked easily, still not a man who made warmth visible without effort, still not a man who could promise that the worst of his habits wouldn't resurface under enough pressure. But she had shown him, by example and patience and the occasional direct confrontation, that being wrong about your own limits was not a defeat. It was information. He thought about what kind of information he still owed her. That evening, after dinner, he asked her to walk with him to the east fence line. She came, without asking why, pulling her coat on in the practical way she did everything, and they walked through the May evening across the yard and past the kitchen garden. Real now, producing, not the dead ambition it had been when she arrived. And out to the fence, he had repaired himself 4 times in 3 years. He stopped and looked at the land. "I stood here last August," he said. The night before your letter arrived. I was counting what I had left. She stood beside him. She waited. It was a short list, he said. I remember you telling me, she said. I didn't tell you this part, he said. I stood here and I thought about what it would mean if the ranch went, and I couldn't make myself care the way I thought I should. The ranch was everything I'd worked for, but I was standing there thinking about selling it, and I was almost relieved, which scared me more than anything else. He paused. I didn't know then that the problem wasn't the ranch. The problem was that there was nothing in the ranch worth saving it for. The May evening was quiet around them, the kind of quiet that had weather moving somewhere far off, but was still here. And now? She said. He turned to look at her. Now there is, he said. She looked at him. In the dying light of the evening, she looked exactly like what she was. A woman who had arrived with one suitcase and rebuilt a dying place piece by piece, not as a performance and not as a sacrifice, but because she was someone who looked at broken things and saw what they could be rather than what they were. Ethan, she said, I need to ask you something. All right, when you wrote that letter, she said, the arrangement, the practical terms, did you write it because you believed that was all you could offer, or because you were testing something? He considered this. He gave it the honest thought it deserved. Both, he said. I believed it was all I had, and somewhere underneath that I was hoping to be wrong. She nodded slowly. I answered it for the same reason, she said. I told myself it was practical. I needed a situation. The terms were honest, but I read that letter 6 times before I wrote back, and I don't read things 6 times that I've already decided about. He looked at her. I was hoping too, she said. I just didn't admit it until much later. The fence line held them for another minute, the two of them standing in the early dark of a Montana May evening, the land spreading out in every direction in its vast impractical beauty, neither of them saying anything because what they'd said was enough. He reached over and took her hand the way he had on the train from Kansas City, steadily, without ceremony. She held it the same way. They walked back to the house. The summer that followed was not effortless. Ethan would have been suspicious of effortless. The Northfield produced well, but the South End had a blight problem in July that cost them 3 weeks of anxious management before they got ahead of it. The school had a disagreement between 2 families over their children that Clara had to mediate with the patience of a woman who understood that small community friction was not solved but navigated. Hector hurt his shoulder in August, and Ethan spent 2 weeks covering work that Hector's shoulder was supposed to handle, which left him more tired than he'd been in a year. But it was a different kind of tired. Not the exhaustion of a man running alone against an accumulation of losses, but the tiredness of someone doing real work inside a life that had weight and direction to it. He could tell the difference. He hadn't been able to for a long time. Now he could. The harvest that fall was the best the Cole Ranch had seen in 6 years. Not spectacular, so the land was not a spectacular land, and the seasons in Montana did not do spectacular on a reliable basis, but genuinely good, enough to retire the remaining bank debt with room left over, enough to look at the following year without the particular arithmetic of a man who is trying to figure out how to stretch what isn't quite sufficient. Hector, when the last of the count was done and the numbers were on paper, said, "We made it." "We made it," Ethan agreed. "She'll want to put more of it into the school fund," Hector said. "She mentioned it," Ethan said. Hector nodded, unsurprised. He had arrived, somewhere in the course of the year, at a settled understanding of Clara that expressed itself not in speeches, but in the simple way he incorporated her decisions into his sense of how things worked. Not as external interventions, but as part of the ranch's logic. That was, Ethan thought, probably the truest measure of what had changed. Not the harvest numbers, not the school building on the Hawkins parcel, not the legal victory in Kansas City, though all of those things were real. The truest measure was that the ranch operated now as a place where more than one person's judgment was woven into every decision, and the place was better for it, and everyone who worked in it knew it. On the last evening of October, almost exactly 1 year from the morning they had driven to the bank together with the October payment, Clara came out to the east fence line. He was already there. He had started coming back to it more often, in the way that people return to the places where significant things happened, not from sentiment, but from the need to compare what you see now against what you saw then. She stood beside him. "A year," she said. "Near enough," he said. "The South End numbers are up 9% from last year," she said. "I worked it out this morning." "I know," he said. "You left the ledger open." "I know I left it open," she said. He almost smiled. They stood in the October dark, and he thought about the question he'd asked himself at this fence line a year ago. What he had left to lose? And the terrible shortness of the list, and the strange relief he'd felt at the prospect of losing the last of it, which had frightened him more than the losing. He thought about what was on the list now. He thought about 17 children in a school building on the Hawkins parcel, about Marta Gunderson, who was 13 now, and had begun doing the actual accounts for her family's farm and saving them money in the process. About Agnes Renner, who had come to this fence line as a stranger and was now someone he understood to be a friend of his wife's, which by extension made her something in his own life too. About Hector, who had stayed 11 years out of stubbornness and was now staying out of something more like investment. About Dorothy Strand, who taught the younger children 3 days a week and had stopped looking like a woman making do with less than she deserved. About Clara, who stood beside him in the October dark and had arrived 12 months ago with one suitcase and had piece by patient piece made this place worth the work it required. There were things he still didn't know about how to love a person properly. He made mistakes that were specific to his nature, the silences that lasted too long, the decisions made alone out of habit before the habit caught itself, the occasional reversion to the man who had stood at this fence and thought survival meant carrying every weight by himself. He was not going to be finished making those mistakes. Clara knew this because Clara was not a woman who confused the truth with the version of truth that would be more comfortable to hold. But he had learned something real in the course of this year that he had not known before and that he did not expect to unknow. He had learned that strength was not the refusal of help. Any man could refuse help. It was easy. It cost nothing except everything it cost. Real strength was the harder thing, choosing who deserved to stand beside you and then letting them stand there, actually letting them, in the full and inconvenient and occasionally maddening reality of what that meant day after day on hard ground under an indifferent sky. He had spent years believing that self-sufficiency was the most honest thing a person could be. He had been wrong. Self-sufficiency, taken far enough, was just loneliness with better posture. What was honest? What he had found out in the daily practice of this year, in the arguments and the ledger, and the train to Kansas City and the evenings at the fence line and the hand held without ceremony, was that no one built anything real alone. You could maintain things alone. You could hold things together alone for a while, at great cost. But building something that grew and changed and produced and mattered, required two people who could tell each other the truth and withstand what the truth required. He had been lucky to learn this. He knew he had been lucky because not everyone got a second chance at the things they'd closed the door on, and he had. He had gotten a letter from Missouri and a woman with one suitcase who had seen past the cold terms of a practical arrangement to the actual man underneath and had decided, not impulsively, not romantically, but with the full, deliberate weight of a choice made by someone who understood what she was choosing, that he was worth the work. He intended not to waste it. "The school fund," he said. "What were you thinking for the spring edition?" She turned to look at him. She had not expected him to start there. "I was thinking we could fund a second teacher's full salary," she said. "Dorothy's been sharing the younger class with me 3 days a week, and it's not enough. The children need consistency. And the building, is the space enough?" "I'd like to add a room," she said, "by next fall." The Reese brothers said they could do it for less than the original build, since they know the structure already. He nodded. He had already been thinking about how it fit into the following year's numbers. It fit, with room to spare. "Do it," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Just like that?" "Just like that," he said. "You know what it needs? You know what we can do. I trust your numbers." She looked at him in the October dark, this woman he had written a cold letter to, and who had answered it for reasons that were both practical and not. And he thought about how strangely the large things in a life could arrive, Not as events, but as letters. Not as revelations, but as the slow accumulation of ordinary days that turned out, assembled together, to have been something other than ordinary. "All right," she said. She took his arm, not his hand this time. Took his arm the way people do when they are walking back somewhere together and expect to keep walking together for a long time. And they turned away from the fence line and walked back toward the house, which had lights in the windows and warmth behind the door, and all the evidence of a life that had been built, imperfectly and honestly, by two people who had chosen each other with eyes open. The land stretched out behind them in the October dark, vast and indifferent as ever. It did not care that something real had taken root in it, but something real had.